Hi, good afternoon, guys, and welcome to our latest series in the ECIST video podcast. It's my absolute pleasure to welcome the absolutely amazing Rachael Brown from the Royal Wolverhampton Trust with us this afternoon. And Rachel's been amazing, really, because she's been one of our national unscheduled care coordination pilot sites since we started this bit of a kind of wacky way of doing things differently over the last couple of years or so. So I'd like to welcome the amazing Rachael to our podcast this afternoon. Rachael, thank you so much for giving up your time to come and speak to us this afternoon about your experience about testing out our model of unscheduled care coordination that you co-designed and helped us create. So bless you for that. So just three brief questions for you, if that's okay today. Starting with our first question is, what really sparked your interest in testing out the unscheduled care coordination model?
Okay, so I think, Paul, it's probably best if I start with kind of doing a bit of the backstory. So tell you about where we started from. So I think originally I joined RWT probably 2 years ago now, under the role of programme lead for community transformation. So myself and my colleague Kate were looking at community services as a whole. We wanted to understand, some of the processes that they deployed, equally looking at, the skills that the team had got, the structures within the team. So everything and anything that came under community services. And part of that, I think, we recognised that there were certain things or certain drivers for change that we wanted to address. So some of the things for us that kind of thought we wanted to do things differently and what that might look like. So we'd already currently got a single point of access. But what we found is that even though we'd got multiple triage points going on. So each of the teams were already doing their own triage as well. We also had like a reliance on the referrer kind of knowing which team to refer to. So it meant that sometimes patients got to the wrong service, and then we had this massive, really long, convoluted way of kind of getting back into the right service. So a really long process associated with that. Over the years as well, we'd had like new services come on board with community services, and they'd just kind of like been bolted on. So they'd been commissioned separately. So they were just like add-ons to what we would traditionally know as community services. And then because of the way that some of the services were commissioned, we got patients who had got long-term condition problems. And what had happened with those is that they'd be on the service for a set number of days in line with their service spec. And then they'd get discharged back off. And then a few weeks later, they'd bounce back onto the caseload. But then equally, they'd have to go through this really long-winded way of getting back onto the service. So we recognised that there were quite a few things that just didn't really add up for us and that didn't make us work very efficiently. And recognising that some patients as well used to call our call handling service just to have like a bit of a chat. So they were quite lonely, but they'd ring multiple times. They didn't really need anything, or they didn't perceive to have a need at that time, but it just meant that they'd ring quite a lot. So I think the concept around care coordination and what that might look like for us kind of was born out of all that need for doing something differently. So we kind of created a vision around what that might look like in terms of what we wanted to achieve. And some of the things that we wanted from that was that we wanted to remain, we have a single point of access, but that access, we wanted to grow it into a single point of triage as well. So we had a vision of having a group of multi-professionals who would all work together. We wanted to completely move away from a referrer knowing which service to kind of refer into, and we wanted it to be based very much on what that patient needs. So we talked a lot about, what is the right thing for that patient next? So what is their need currently? And we as experts in community and knowing our services inside out, we wanted to be able to help navigate that patient through that instead of somebody who has no idea about what we do in community doing that. So I think that's where we wanted to get to. The other thing for us is that we knew that some patients kind of went up and down like that care continuum. So some days they might need an acute nurse to go out and see them, so they might need an AMP skills. But a few weeks later, they might just need a bit of hand-holding and a bit of social support. So we recognised that we wanted to kind of do both ends of the spectrum, but do it within a kind of coordinated approach. So I think that's kind of where we wanted to get to in terms of our care coordination.
So that's fantastic. Well done, you. And I've seen you guys in action quite a few times now and spent some time with you. So I kind of know my own kind of answer to the next thing really. But I mean, from your perspective, how would you describe the key benefits to patients then as a result of all this stuff you're doing, making it slicker and quicker and easier to access the right stuff, but particularly the knock-on benefit to the acute hospital site?
Yeah. So if I start with from a trust perspective, really, so I think quite early on we recognised that as an acute trust, we're not going to grow our acute bed base. I think we're quite clear on that. And I think from a community perspective, that obviously the community service had come had belonged to part of the trust as part of TCS days, and I really think that we haven't really done much development work with them, so they were pretty much quite traditional in their way and their approach to managing services. So I think as a group, we really wanted to bring something to the table. So we wanted to make sure that our offer was heard loud and clear, really, in terms of community services. So I think for us, we had an issue where we had like patients whose preferred place of death would be at home, but we had quite a high number of still patients dying in hospital. So we thought that through care coordination we could support patients better in that way. In terms of ED conveyancing, so a lot of the patients on our caseload were the patients that bounced in quite often to ED, and then obviously ended up getting admitted into the deep bed base and then deconditioning, and then coming out and needing far more services than they did when they first went. And if they did manage to get back home. So we recognise that we've got some issues in terms of ED conveyancing, and equally it was about people knowing about what services were out there for them to access. We also know, like most acute trusts, that we've got an issue in terms of long length of stay for patients, and patients who've got an excess of 21 days in a hospital bed. So I think recognising all of that, we realised that actually we wanted to do something different from a trust perspective. So from a patient perspective, I think some of the benefits for them has been that a patient's obviously care is, we recognise that patients want to be at home and they want to stay in the home as long as possible. And I think we wanted to obviously have an offer for patients, but making that we could keep them at home for longer, but also keep them at home well as well. So patients liked the fact that they could stay at home more, so they didn't have to jump in an ambulance to go up to ED, that they could stay in home and be cared for. The other thing that I think from a benefit from a patient perspective is that a lot of the staff that were caring for these patients when they were at home were people that they already knew. So they'd been on a community nursing caseload before, or they were known to the community matrons from long-term condition, or they'd seen some of our urgent care nurses in terms of rapid response. So they kind of knew some of the team as well. So I think from them they had that that familiarity about knowing the staff that were looking after them. Preferred place of death as well for some patients. So what generally happened is that a patient would get escalated up to ED or into the acute bed base, and then some of their wishes might have got forgotten about. So it meant that they might have wanted to actually die at home, but for whatever reason they got bounced in, and that never really happened for them. Time ran out for them. I think the other thing from a patient perspective is that by knowing the patients better, it meant that we were able to have those conversations, those difficult ones about, what do you do if you deteriorate, and where do you want to be? So I think that some of those surprise questions around what does this mean for patients and how can we care for them in a better way. And I think the other thing that we did as part of, which has been a real benefit really, is that we recognise that social element of patients calling, and being lonely, particularly during COVID as well. So we did set up an almost befriending service for some patients, which meant that we worked very closely with our social prescribing team around those patients that might just need a chat once a week, just to kind of keep tabs on how they're doing. They didn't particularly have a need, or maybe they didn't have a perceived need from a health perspective, but certainly by not addressing some of those needs, I think some patients did deteriorate quite quickly, or we ended up having bigger problems further down the line. So I think there was an element of how we handhold some patients. And I think one big thing for us, and it's a way that we've worked that's meant that we've worked slightly differently, is that we wanted to move away from having a referral process for our own individual teams. Before we would, we'd have to have a referral from one team to another. And I think a lot of that was kind of necessitated by kind of being counting, so from a commissioned service point of view, we had to make sure that we were doing the contracted activity. So we kind of got a little bit obsessive about, referrals and counting activity. So it meant that patients kind of missed out on opportunities to see different professional groups just because they weren't referred into the right service. So by kind of loosening the reins on some of that and making it that it was all right just to kind of ring somebody else who was in that service and say, could you just have a look at this lady or this gentleman for me? It just made it a lot easier. We wanted to move away from that big thing where we had teams saying, that's not my patient, or I haven't got capacity to see that patient. We wanted a far greater flexible workforce that meant as that patient's needs changed on a day-to-day basis, so could that team's response to that individual. So that was kind of that's my personal view on kind of how I think it benefits patients.
Well, I mean, that is transformational, isn't it? And gosh, if we had that across the country, we'd just see so much more people being cared for at home. And I think one of the things that struck me about actually sort of being in amongst and seeing the guys working your model is you make it very simple and very quick for clinicians to phone up and say, not to go through a 40-minute question and answer referral process with nothing at the end, but to say what their patient needs clinically and how quickly they need it, and then the team work out how best to respond. You might already have something planned for them. It's absolutely fantastic to see. So, well done you and the guys that are working and developing it. So just on the development point, my last question for you, Rachael, if I may, is one around the future, around care coordination. And I'd be keen to understand your thoughts about how you'd like to develop it going forward.
Yeah, so I think just to kind of let you know that as part of care coordination, it's obviously part of a big community transformation program that they had running. And initially we had like a change of, went through a management of change with our clinicians. And our go live date for some of this was the 1st of April last year. So you can imagine we kind of hit COVID and we were like, oh, we're in a massive, just about to launch a huge new transformation program. So I think, if anything, COVID gave us a real opportunity for us to kind of move on care coordination really quickly. And some of the reasons for that was we wanted to make sure that we reduce footfall into people's houses. So we knew that as a number one, which care coordination would give us that opportunity. Secondly, we didn't really want to send a lot of staff that couldn't be patient facing out to other areas. We wanted to keep that expertise. So we were one areas within the trust where actually we kind of kept all our staff, but we just made them work in a very different way. So it meant that some of our expert nurses and clinicians were able to kind of stay within a care coordination role, supporting patients virtually and digitally, which we've never ever done before. And thirdly, around that was it just meant that it actually meant that we were kind of releasing time to care as well, because it meant that some of that patient, clinicians phoning each other, or some of the process that we'd got that was really clunky, it meant that we got rid of some of that. So it meant that actually our nurses and physios and OTs could kind of get on and do the job that they wanted to do, instead of kind of doing a bit of paper exercise stuff. So there were lots of benefits of COVID for us. Because of that, though, because we kind of set it up at speed, we probably did it quite quick. It was a bit of on the back of a fag packet. This is what we're going to do. So probably 6 months, if we look at like 6 months in, probably after the end of the first wave and things, we knew that some bits were kind of like a little bit frayed around the edges. They weren't quite as we wanted. So we did spend a little bit of time backtracking and just kind of looking what it was. And the only way to relate to this is like if we think of like a PDSA cycle and we've got like various cycles that are going up a hill, we had to roll back a couple of cycles just to kind of look at, God, have we got this right? Or is it still really clunky? Or what were we even thinking about doing that? So in terms, I kind of think of the next probably year, I'm really excited because we've had a change in matron for that. So we've now got Lee on board as the matron for our supportive care, as we call it. Our care coordination hub sits within that. We've got two new service delivery managers. So we've got Beck and Amy that have joined us as well. And they're like a dynamic trio, them three. So obviously, God, it'll be, we'll be running 100 miles an hour for them. But some of the stuff in terms of vision for that, we really want to kind of really look at that team structure for there. We want to make sure that we've got some career progression. We can see a role for, band fours within that in terms of that associate role, in terms of that skill development and how do they support patients and, digitally along that as well. We know that we're going to have some academic evaluation of what we've done as well. So we've got Birmingham City Uni that are quite keen to do some research with us about how does it look. So we're quite excited about that. As part of COVID, our care coordination hub has kind of become the centrepiece really in terms of our oximetry at home programme that we've got on service for patients, and also our COVID virtual ward. So again, that's something that we want to kind of, work on going forward. We've got some buy-in from one of our acute respiratory consultants, Helen Ward, and we've got a lead nurse for that called Tash, that are going to be looking at how do we support respiratory patients better. So we're looking around an early supported discharge model for them and some integration with community and primary about how do we use some of the virtual tech that we've been lucky enough to get from NHSX to support us to do some of the work that we wanted to do in terms of virtual monitoring of patients. So that's a big piece of work. We're also doing another piece of work, which you've been involved with, Paul, around with West Midlands Ambulance, looking at conveyancing and escalation of patients. Particularly this time, we're going to focus on care homes and their escalation plans going, up into the acute trust. But equally, there's lots of work still to do around, our community teams and how, the first response really shouldn't be to kind of phone 999 and how we can support patients more quickly in that way. So there's lots of projects that we've got going forward that which will obviously look at how we kind of strengthen and build on what we're doing. We obviously want to keep on doing the befriending stuff because the staff have absolutely loved doing that, and it's been a real positive for some of our patients as well as some of our staff. We're really keen to kind of look at, that it sounds really silly, but, like that single process in terms, like the referral form becomes a triage form that then becomes the admission form. We kind of see something that kind of moves around the teams that we just add to as opposed to restart that process all over again. So we're not asking patients multiple questions. And it sounds really easy, but that's something that we still spend lots and lots of time doing. So we know that from a process point of view, we've got a lot of work to do around our processes. And then I think the other thing is around, working with our commissioners around how we count our activity. My vision is that, they just commission community services, whether that's, an acute response that's needed within 2 hours or whether that's a response that's needed when patients are end of life. I don't want them to kind of tell us who's working where. I need that flow to be, very patient orientated and that pathway. So I think we've still got, quite a long way to go before we actually get to that. And I think, a big thing for us is that looking at how we can, virtually monitor our patients and also some virtual diagnostics about how us as a care coordination hub can really, manage those patients differently. I'd like to see the ability that we've got, patients can talk to us as much as we can talk to them. I think, sometimes there's still quite a few barriers to patients just picking up the phone or doing a virtual chat with us about what it is that they want. So I think there's lots of things. I mean, I did some interviews recently and they always ask me to answer the question about, what's the vision? And, I'm very clear on that. It's probably anything and everything that we want it to be, how wide is it or how long is it? It's everything. We want people to come in and challenge some of the stuff that we're doing and kind of say why we're doing it that way. And it is, I suppose it's like a really good example of how we have just continuously changed stuff as we've gone along. We've learned from what's not really worked for us, and then kind of gone back to the drawing board and think about what we could do differently and how we could tweak it. And everybody's contributing to that as a team. It's not just about my vision. They're challenging me every single day about why do I think this might work when it won't. So it is very much about a massive, team response about how do services look going forward and what's right for patients ultimately about keeping them at home.
So, gosh, Rachel, that sounds like the next 3 years worth of
my life
to
probably.
me. But it is genuinely inspirational, and that's what it is. And I can't thank you enough for giving us all that kind of insight in terms of what you're doing. I absolutely love working with you whenever I get an opportunity. And I think that's for two key reasons. The first of all, you guys are innovators and you're just kind of do it characters. You get an idea out of somebody's head into action, test as quickly as possible. And I think the positivity and motivation you bring to the service is remarkable. So bless you for that. And I really like your smile sign on your wall behind you there. So that just goes to show what kind of person you are. Rachel, thank you so much for all your time today. It's amazing to hear what you're doing there, and we'll look forward to working with you going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.